He came to the mountains to outrun a memory that had the persistence of a ghost. It did not rattle chains or whisper in the dark. It lived in the hollow space between heartbeats, in the sharp intake of breath before a sudden noise. Elias Vance, who had once moved through the world's most dangerous places with a quiet confidence that bordered on invisibility, now sought a silence deep enough to drown out the echo of his own failure. His canine, a German shepherd named Ghost, sat in the passenger seat of the aging truck, his gaze fixed forward, a silent partner in this self-imposed exile. The dog's presence was the only one Elias could tolerate, a steady, breathing anchor in the shifting tides of his past. He came here not for a miracle, but for an ending, a quiet place where the story could finally run out of pages. But his canine, whose instincts were older and truer than any map, was about to lead him not to an ending, but to a forgotten beginning, hidden beneath a chapel at the edge of a lonely lake. He would find that some secrets are not meant to be buried, and some silences are meant to be broken. The question was whether the man who had run from his own voice would have the strength to speak for the voiceless. Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in second chances and quiet truths, like and subscribe to our channel and let this story unfold. The truck's engine was a low growl that the vast, empty landscape swallowed without effort. Elias drove with an economy of motion, hands resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze sweeping from the cracked asphalt to the jagged line of pines clawing at the sky. He was a man in his 40s, but the years had carved themselves into the lines around his eyes, lines not of laughter, but of vigilance. He was tall and lean, built of the dense, functional muscle that comes not from a gym, but from a life of carrying heavy things over long distances. His uniform never changed, a faded olive field jacket over a worn plaid flannel shirt, cargo pants, and leather boots that had molded themselves to his feet through 1,000 miles of hard terrain. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless, indifferent precision. It was the only clock he paid any attention to. He pulled the truck onto a dirt turnout overlooking a lake so still and dark it looked like a shard of fallen night sky. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was immense, a physical presence that pressed in on the cab. For a moment, he just sat there, listening to it. This was what he had come for. A quiet so profound it might finally starve the memory that fed on noise. Ghost shifted in the passenger seat, the leather creaking under his weight. The dog did not whine or pant. He simply watched Elias, his intelligent brown eyes patient. Ghost was old for a working dog. The fur on his muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and his movements, while still fluid, had a deliberate, measured quality. He was a veteran, just like the man beside him. They had served together in places where the sun baked the earth to the color of bone, and they had retired together into this new, quieter war, the one Elias fought against himself. "All right, boy," Elias said, his voice raspy from disuse. The words felt foreign in the vast silence. He opened his door and swung his legs out. The air was crisp, scented with pine and the clean, cold smell of deep water. It was the smell of a place that had not been disturbed in a long time. He moved to the back of the truck, his movements practiced and efficient. He unlatched the tailgate and pulled out his pack, an Everly stock half-track that had been his companion through sandstorms and mountain passes. Every buckle was clean, every strap secured. Discipline was a muscle, and it was the only one he still exercised without fail. Ghost hopped down from the cab, landing with a soft thud on the packed earth. He didn't bound or explore. Instead, he stood beside Elias, his body aligned with the man's, his head up, ears twitching as he cataloged the sounds of the wilderness. The distant call of a loon, the sigh of the wind through the firs, the lapping of water against the shore. He was not a pet. He was a partner, and he was never entirely off duty. They made their way down a gentle slope to the lake's edge. The shoreline was a collection of smooth, gray stones and twisted driftwood. The water was unnervingly clear. Elias could see the rocky bottom drop away into a black, fathomless depth just a few feet from the shore. He set up his camp with the same methodical precision he did everything else. A small one-man tent, a sleeping roll, a compact stove. He worked without wasted motion, a habit ingrained in him by a life where inefficiency could be fatal. Ghost sat nearby, observing, his posture a silent critique of a tent peg driven at a slightly imperfect angle. Elias caught the look and allowed himself the ghost of a smile. It was the closest he came to humor these days, this dry, internal commentary on his dog's judgmental superiority. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Elias sat on a log, nursing a cup of black coffee from a metal cup. The heat was a small, welcome anchor in the growing chill. The memory he was running from was not a vision, but a sound. The strained whir of a helicopter's rotors, the crackle of a radio, and a voice, cut off mid-sentence. It was the sound of a choice he had made, a command he had followed, a man he had left behind. He had been told it was the right call, the only call. The mission was paramount, but the logic of command did not quiet the conscience of the man. He closed his eyes, the metal cup warm in his hands. He had come here to let the silence do its work, to let the sheer scale of the wilderness diminish the echo in his head. He wanted to feel small, insignificant, a tiny, fleeting part of something ancient and uncaring. That was when he felt it, a subtle shift in the air beside him. He opened his eyes. Ghost, who had been lying in a relaxed posture at his feet, was now rigid. His body was low to the ground, muscles coiled tight. His head was raised, muzzle pointing directly across the dark expanse of the lake. A low, almost inaudible rumble vibrated in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of deep, instinctual unease. Elias followed the dog's line of sight. Across the water, maybe a mile away, the forest grew thick and dark right down to the shore. There was nothing there. No light, no movement, nothing but the monolithic wall of ancient trees. But Elias had learned long ago to trust the dog's senses over his own. Ghost saw things Elias could not. He felt the subtle tremors in the earth, tasted the chemical signature of a threat on the wind. His warnings were never without reason. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered. Ghost didn't move. His breathing was controlled, his focus absolute. He was a living compass needle, pointing to a place where the world was somehow wrong. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves across the water, but it seemed to carry something else, too. A feeling. A sense of old stone and forgotten prayers. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The silence he had sought was no longer empty. It was watchful. And his dog, his partner, was watching back. The mountain seemed to hold its breath, and in that held breath, Elias knew his hope for a quiet ending had just been broken. Something was waiting for him across the water. The night passed in a state of heightened awareness. Elias slept, but it was the shallow, fitful sleep of a soldier on watch, one ear always tuned to the world outside the thin membrane of his tent. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves was filtered through a lifetime of threat assessment. Ghost lay at the entrance of the tent, a silent, unmoving sentinel. His unease from the evening had not subsided. It had settled into a state of quiet, vigilant patience. He was waiting. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain tops, turning the black water to a sheet of polished steel, Elias was already awake. He broke camp with the same quiet efficiency as he had set it up, leaving no trace of his presence. He drank his coffee standing, his eyes fixed on the far shore, the spot where Ghost's attention had been so powerfully drawn. The dog stood beside him, his gaze just as intent. The question of what lay over there was no longer a curiosity. It was a mission. The old instincts, the ones he had tried to bury, were stirring. He had two choices: pack up and drive away, find another lake, another patch of silence. Or he could follow the dog's lead. The first choice was the one the man who had arrived yesterday would have made. The man who wanted to run, to avoid, to disappear. But the sight of his partner, so certain and so focused, had awakened a different man. The one who had always moved toward the anomaly, not away from it. "Okay," he said, the word a quiet surrender. "Let's go see." There was no boat. The journey would be on foot, a long hike around the northern curve of the lake. He cinched his pack tight, checked the simple compass on his watch, and set off, Ghost trotting just ahead of him. The dog moved with a new purpose. He was no longer just a companion. He was a guide. He didn't need to look back to know Elias was following. Their bond was older than words, a silent contract of trust forged in the crucible of shared danger. They moved through the dense forest that ringed the lake. The air was cool and damp under the canopy of pines. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick ceiling of needles, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. For hours, the only sounds were the soft crunch of their footfalls on the bed of pine needles and the rhythmic sound of their own breathing. Elias let his mind go quiet, focusing on the simple mechanics of the hike. The placement of his feet, the feel of the pack on his shoulders, the steady pace. It was a familiar meditation, the rhythm of the march. After nearly 2 hours of hard walking, Ghost's pace changed. He slowed, his body lowering slightly, his nose sampling the air with more intensity. They were getting close. The undergrowth became thicker here, a tangle of thorny bushes and grasping vines that seemed to intentionally block their path. It felt like the land itself was guarding something. Ghost pushed through it without hesitation, and Elias followed, the branches scratching at his jacket. Then, they broke through the thicket into a small, unnaturally clear space. And there it was. It was a chapel. A small, simple structure made of heavy gray stones, covered in a thick blanket of ivy. It stood not 20 yards from the water's edge, nestled in a grove of ancient, weeping willows. The roof, made of slate, was sagging in the middle, and a few tiles were missing, like lost teeth. The wooden door had long since rotted away, leaving a dark, gaping maw. A single, small bell tower, green with moss, listed to one side, its bell silent for what must have been generations. It was a place entirely lost to time, a forgotten stone in the deep green wilderness. Elias stopped, a feeling of profound reverence washing over him. This was the source of Ghost's unease. Not a threat, but an irregularity. A thing that did not belong in this wild, untamed place. Ghost walked slowly toward the entrance, his claws clicking softly on a flagstone path nearly consumed by grass. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Elias, a clear invitation. Elias moved forward, his boots silent on the overgrown stone. He ran a hand over the cold, damp rocks of the wall. They were perfectly fitted, the work of a skilled mason. This chapel was not built to be temporary. It was built to last, to stand against the wind and the rain and the passage of years. He stepped through the doorway into the gloom within. The air inside was still and heavy, thick with the smell of dust, damp stone, and decaying wood. Shafts of light lanced down from the holes in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust like tiny lost souls. A few simple wooden pews, their finish long gone, were still arranged in neat rows. At the far end, a stone altar stood before a tall, narrow window frame that now held only a view of the dark trees outside. There was no glass left. It was a place of deep, profound peace, but also of deep, profound sadness. Elias felt like an intruder in a sacred space. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He noticed small details that spoke of a hasty departure. A hymnal left open on a pew, its pages fused together by moisture. A small carved wooden bird lying on its side on the floor. This place hadn't just been abandoned, it felt like it had been evacuated. He reached the altar. It was a solid block of granite, simple and unadorned. He placed a hand on its surface. It was cold as a tombstone. He felt a strange sense of connection, a feeling that a story was held within these stones, a story that was waiting to be read. He had come here to escape his own story, and instead, he had stumbled into someone else's. That was when Ghost acted. The dog had been sniffing methodically around the base of the altar. Now, he stopped. He pawed once, twice, at a large, flat flagstone set directly in front of the altar. The stone was no different from any other on the floor, but Ghost was insistent. He looked up at Elias, let out a soft whine, and pawed at the stone again. His message was unmistakable. Here. Something is here. Elias knelt, his knee protesting on the hard stone. He examined the flagstone. The seams around it were filled with dirt and moss, but as he looked closer, he saw that the fit was too perfect, the edges too clean. This was not just a piece of the floor. It was a cover. He took out his folding knife, the blade sharp and practical. He used the tip to carefully scrape the dirt from the seam. After a few minutes of work, he had cleared one edge. He tried to get his fingers under it, but it wouldn't budge. It was heavy, set deep in the earth. He needed leverage. He looked around the decaying chapel and found what he was looking for. A long, rusted piece of iron that might have once been a brace for the roof. He wedged the iron bar into the seam and put his weight on it. The metal groaned in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grating sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the chapel's long silence, the stone shifted. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. Elias worked the bar again, grunting with the effort, his muscles straining. The stone scraped against its neighbors, and slowly, painstakingly, he levered it up and tilted it back. A wave of cold, musty air washed over him, a smell of sealed earth and time itself. Beneath the flagstone was not dirt, but a set of steep, narrow steps carved from the same gray stone, disappearing into absolute darkness. It was a cellar, a crypt, a place hidden with deliberate intent. Ghost peered into the blackness, his body tense, but he did not growl. His discovery was made. Now it was up to the man. Elias stared down into that waiting dark. He had a powerful instinctual urge to push the stone back, to walk away and leave this place to its secrets. This was not his business. This was not his fight. He had come here for peace, not for mysteries buried under forgotten churches. But then he looked at Ghost, at the unwavering trust in the dog's eyes. And he thought of the story held in these stones, a story someone had gone to great lengths to preserve. To walk away now would feel like a different kind of failure, a failure of curiosity, a failure of respect. It would be another silence, another thing left behind. He took a small, powerful flashlight from a pouch on his pack, its beam cutting a sharp white cone into the oppressive dark. The steps were slick with moisture but looked solid. He took a deep breath, the cold, ancient air filling his lungs. "All right, boy," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Stay here. He swung his legs over the edge and placed his boot on the first step. The darkness seemed to rise up to meet him, to swallow him whole. He descended, one slow step at a time, into the heart of the forgotten chapel's secret. The town was a single sleepy street clinging to the side of a highway, a place most people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It had a gas station, a diner with a faded sign, and a small brick building that housed the county clerk's office, the library, and the sheriff's substation. It was a place that held its history close. Elias parked his truck and walked toward the building, feeling conspicuous in his rugged gear. The people he passed gave him a wide berth, their glances a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was an outsider, an unknown quantity, and in a town this small, that was a loud statement. He entered the county clerk's office. The air inside smelled of old paper, floor wax, and brewing coffee. Behind a high wooden counter sat a woman who looked as if she had been carved from the same tough, unyielding hickory as the surrounding mountains. She was in her late 50s or early 60s, tall and spare, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a no-nonsense cardigan. This was a woman who understood rules and the importance of keeping them. She looked up from a large ledger as he approached, her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and clear. "I hope so," Elias said. "I'm looking for information about the land around the north end of Blackwood Lake." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of information?" "Old maps, property records, anything from before the reservoir was created." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his worn jacket, the discipline in his posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He didn't fidget or fill the silence with unnecessary words. He just waited. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. "Most of those records are in the archive. Not many people ask for them anymore," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "What exactly are you looking for?" "There's a structure on the North Shore," Elias said, choosing his words carefully. "A small, stone chapel. It's not on any of my current maps." A flicker of something, recognition, surprise, passed through her eyes, so quick he almost missed it. She stood and walked to a wall of filing cabinets, her movements efficient. She pulled open a long, flat drawer and began flipping through large, rolled maps. "The Blackwood Reservoir project was in the late 50s, she said, not looking at him. "A lot of the valley was acquired by the Northern Cascade Power Authority. Farms, homes, a whole town. It was controversial." She pulled out a large, yellowed map and unrolled it on the counter. The paper was brittle at the edges. "This is the pre-flood survey from 1956. Elias leaned over it. The map was beautifully detailed, a ghost of a lost world. He saw the winding path of the original river, the outlines of farmsteads with family names written beside them, the grid of a small town labeled Havenwood, now sitting at the bottom of the lake. He traced the shoreline with his finger, moving toward the area where he'd found the chapel. There was nothing marked there, just dense contour lines indicating a steep, wooded hillside. "It's not here," he said. "No," the clerk agreed. "It wouldn't be. The survey was done for the Power Authority. They only mapped what they were interested in acquiring or demolishing." She looked at him, her gaze direct. If someone built something they didn't want the authority to know about, they wouldn't have put it on a map. She tapped a finger on the name Havenwood. "They say the last family held out for years, refused to sell, refused to leave. The story goes they built a place to keep their history safe before the waters rose." She paused. "Most people think it's just a story." "My name is Margaret," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her hand cool. Elias, he replied. Elias, she repeated, as if testing the weight of it. If you want to know the real story of that valley, you need to talk to Arthur Finch. He was the junior surveyor on this project. He's retired now, lives a few miles out of town. He remembers everything. Margaret gave him directions, writing them down on a slip of paper with a sharp, angular script. There was an unspoken understanding in her eyes. She had given him more than just information. She had given him a thread to pull. Arthur Finch lived in a small house cluttered with books, maps, and strange-looking brass instruments. He was a small, bird-like man in his 80s, with a halo of white hair and eyes that lit up with a fiery passion when he spoke about his life's work. He welcomed Elias in as if he'd been expecting him, clearing a space on a table piled high with geological surveys. "Margaret called," he said, his voice a reedy but energetic rasp. "Said a man was asking about the chapel. I haven't heard anyone mention the chapel in 30 years. Elias explained what he had found, describing the stone building, the overgrown path, the feeling of a place intentionally hidden. Arthur listened, nodding, his eyes gleaming. "They did it," he whispered when Elias finished. "The Abernethys. They actually did it." He explained that the Abernethy family had been the heart of the town of Havenwood. They were stonemasons and farmers who had lived in the valley for generations. When the Power Authority came with their buyout offers and their eminent domain threats, the Abernethys refused. They organized the resistance. "It wasn't a fair fight," Arthur said, his voice laced with an old anger. "The authority used every trick in the book. Lowball offers, intimidation, cutting off access roads. They picked the families off one by one until only old Jedediah Abernethy and his family were left. He swore he would not let the history of their community be washed away. He said they would build an ark for their story." Arthur's hands trembled with excitement. "I was just a kid then, a chain man on the survey crew. I remember seeing them hauling stone up that hillside. We were all under orders to ignore it. Not on the project plan, my boss would say. They were erasing that family from the map before the water even got to them." He looked at Elias, his expression pleading. "What did you find in there, son? What did they save?" The weight of the question settled on Elias. He hadn't just stumbled on a ruin. He had stumbled on the last act of a people's defiance. He had found their ark. He drove back to the lake as the sun began to set, the old surveyor's story echoing in his mind. He and Ghost made the long hike back to the chapel, this time with a sense of purpose. When he arrived, the stone building seemed different, no longer just a sad, forgotten place. It felt defiant. It had kept its watch for over 60 years. Waiting. With his flashlight in hand, he descended the stone steps again. The air was just as cold, but it no longer felt menacing. It felt sacred. The cellar was small, a 10 by 10-foot room, its stone walls slick with condensation but remarkably dry. On a wide stone shelf carved from the far wall, there sat a single object. A heavy, footlocker-sized box made of riveted steel, green with a patina of age. It was secured with 2 heavy-duty latches. Elias ran his gloved hand over the cold metal. This was it. The ark. He worked the latches, his fingers stiff with cold. They were rusted, but not seized. With a groan of protest, the first one gave way, then the second. He lifted the heavy lid. The inside was lined with oilcloth. Nestled within were several leather-bound journals, the paper filled with elegant, dense script. There was a bundle of property deeds tied with a faded ribbon, and in the center there were 24 small metal spools of audio tape, each one carefully labeled with a name and a date. At the very bottom of the box was a small hand-cranked device with an earpiece, a portable reel-to-reel player, a piece of military surplus from a bygone era. He picked up a journal. The first entry was dated 1957. "The authority came again today," it began. "Mr. Sterling offered us pennies on the dollar. He smiles, but his eyes are like chips of glass." Elias felt a jolt. Sterling. A common name, surely. A coincidence. He put the journal down and selected one of the audio tapes. It was labeled Jedediah Abernathy, Final Testimony. With fumbling fingers, he threaded the thin tape into the player. He put the single earpiece to his ear and began to turn the crank. There was a hiss, a crackle, and then a voice emerged from the decades of silence. It was an old man's voice, rough but steady, filled with a righteous, weary anger. "They think the water will wash it all away," the voice said, clear as if the man were in the room. "They think a map can erase a life's work, can erase a home. But stone remembers, and we are people of stone. We are leaving this record for whoever finds it, a testament against the men who would drown a valley for profit, who would call it progress to steal a man's land and his history. The lead man, his name is Sterling. He told us we were standing in the way of the future. But a future built on a bed of lies is no future at all. We will not be moved, and we will not be forgotten." The voice continued, detailing the threats, the broken promises, the slow, methodical strangulation of his community. But as Elias listened, another sound began to bleed through the old man's words. A memory. The whir of helicopter blades, the frantic crackle of a radio, the voice of his wounded teammate. "Don't leave me, Elias. Don't you leave me." He had followed his orders. He had chosen the mission over the man. He had left him. Elias snatched the earpiece away, his breath catching in his chest. The two voices, one from 60 years ago and one from the raw, unhealed wound of his own past, merged into a single, damning accusation. "You left us. You walked away." He sat there in the cold, dark cellar, the weight of two histories pressing down on him. He had come to this wilderness to escape one ghost, only to be handed another. The silence he had craved was gone, replaced by the voices of the forgotten. If this chapter of a story that started in silence stirred something in you, take a moment to honor it. The world is full of forgotten chapels and lost stories, waiting for someone with a loyal heart to find them. If you believe in the courage it takes to listen and the strength it takes to act, then like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us about a time you found something you weren't looking for. And subscribe to our channel so we can continue to uncover these quiet miracles together. Sometimes the Lord asks us to stay and listen. Let's do that, together. He didn't know how long he sat there in the dark, the hand-crank player silent in his lap. The sun had set, and the deep, star-filled night of the mountains had fallen. Ghost remained at the top of the stairs, a patient shadow against the faint light from the open doorway of the chapel. He was standing guard. Finally, Elias moved. He carefully packed the journals and tapes back into the steel box. He could not leave them here. To do so would be to bury them a second time. He heaved the heavy box up the stone steps, his muscles protesting the weight. When he emerged into the chapel, the air felt warmer, thinner. He set the box down near the entrance and took a deep, steadying breath. He had a choice to make. He could take the box, disappear back into the anonymity he had cultivated, and mail it to a newspaper or a historical society. That would be the safe, logical move. It would fulfill the spirit of his discovery without inviting conflict. Or he could stay. He could stand with this place, with the memory of Jedediah Abernathy. He could become the guardian the old man had hoped for. Staying meant confrontation. It meant abandoning his exile and re-engaging with a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. It meant risk. Before he could fully form the thought, the decision was made for him. A bright, clean beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness outside, sweeping across the chapel's entrance. Ghost didn't bark. He moved silently to stand directly in front of Elias, his body a low, solid wall of muscle. A quiet, menacing rumble started deep in his chest. A figure stepped into the light of his own beam. He was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in expensive, brand-new outdoor gear that looked like it had been purchased for this specific trip. His hair was perfectly styled, his face pleasant and handsome. He held the flashlight with a casual confidence, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, moved past Elias to the steel box on the floor. "That's quite a find," the man said, his voice smooth and reasonable. It was the kind of voice used to calm nervous investors and dismiss inconvenient problems. "You must be the camper the locals were talking about." Elias said nothing. He remained still, his hand resting lightly on Ghost's back, feeling the tension in the dog's powerful shoulders. "My name is Sterling," the man said, extending a hand that Elias made no move to take. "I'm with the Watershed Authority. We manage this land." He let his hand drop without a trace of awkwardness. "We were scheduled for a routine survey of the area. There are plans for a new recreational development, a high-end lodge, some lakeside cabins. This entire North Shore is slated for redevelopment." Sterling. The name from the journal, from the old man's testimony. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't a coincidence. This was the same entity, the same legacy of erasure passed down through the generations. The son or grandson, perhaps, carrying on the family business. Sterling's gaze settled on the open cellar entrance behind Elias. "It seems you've found some local folklore," he said, his tone patronizing. "Old Jedediah Abernathy's little time capsule." "We've known about this place for years, of course. It's structurally unsound, a public safety hazard. We were actually planning to have it sealed this week." He took a step closer. Ghost's rumble deepened, becoming a low, visceral threat. Sterling stopped. He looked at the dog, a flicker of annoyance crossing his smooth features before being replaced by his mask of polite reason. "That's a beautiful animal," he said. "Well trained." He looked back at Elias. "Look, I understand. This feels significant. It's a piece of history. But it's history that's, frankly, out of context. The Abernathy situation was complex. The project brought prosperity to this entire region. You can't stand in the way of progress." Elias felt the words like a physical blow. Standing in the way of the future. The exact phrase from Jedediah's tape. He thought of the journals, the deeds, the voices on the spools, the carefully preserved evidence of theft and intimidation, dismissed as folklore. "What's in the box is evidence," Elias said, his voice low and steady. He had not intended to speak, but the words came out hard as stones. Sterling laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Evidence of what? A property dispute from 60 years ago? It's a historical curiosity, nothing more. And legally, it's the property of the Watershed Authority, as it rests on our land." He pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket. "But I appreciate your initiative. You've saved us some trouble. We can offer you a finder's fee for your efforts. Let's say $5,000 for your time and for your discretion." It was a bribe, packaged as a reward.
an offer to buy his silence, just as his predecessor had tried to buy the Abernathy's land. Walk away. Forget what you found. It's just business. Elias didn't move. He didn't need to. His silence was its own answer.
He reached down, and without taking his eyes off Sterling, picked up the small hand-cranked audio player from the ground beside the box. He held it up. He didn't have to play it. The gesture was enough. Sterling's smile finally vanished. The politeness dropped away, leaving something cold and hard in its place. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Mr. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name." "Vance," Elias said. "Mr. Vance," Sterling continued, his voice now clipped and precise. "You are currently trespassing on private property. The object in your possession is legally ours. If you were to remove it, that would be theft. This could become a very complicated and unpleasant legal matter for you. Your name, your reputation, it would all be subject to public scrutiny. I'm sure a man like you values his privacy." It was a threat, veiled in the language of law and consequence. A threat to drag him back into the world he had fled, to expose him, to dismantle the quiet life he had tried to build. As Sterling spoke the word, privacy, Ghost made his judgment. It was not a dramatic move. He simply shifted his weight forward, and for the first time, his lip curled back just enough to reveal the white, formidable length of his canine tooth. A low, guttural sound, the sound of ultimate warning, issued from his throat. It was the sound a wolf makes before it closes its jaws on the throat of its rival. It was a definitive, unambiguous statement of intent. Sterling took an involuntary step back. The mask of civility was gone completely now, replaced by a raw, naked anger. He looked from the dog to the man, and in Elias's unblinking gaze, he found no fear, no hesitation. He found only resolve. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said, his voice tight. He lowered his flashlight and took another step back, melting into the darkness he had emerged from. A moment later, Elias heard the sound of him crashing back through the undergrowth, his retreat far less graceful than his arrival. Elias stood there for a long time, the silence of the chapel settling around him again. But it was a different silence now. It was charged, tense. The first move had been made. The battle for the story of Havenwood had begun, and he was no longer a spectator. He was a sentinel. He reached down and rested his hand on Ghost's head. The dog's muscles were still tense, but the deep growl had subsided. "Good boy," Elias whispered. He had made his choice. He was staying. The sky had been a clear, brilliant blue that morning, but now, as afternoon wore on, a change was coming. A line of dark, bruised-looking clouds was massing over the western peaks, advancing with a slow, inexorable purpose. The wind picked up, carrying a damp, electric smell. A storm was building. The kind of sudden, violent squall that could turn the placid lake into a churning cauldron and the quiet forest into a maelstrom of whipping branches and blinding rain. The mountains were preparing for a fight, and Elias felt a grim sense of synchronicity. He had spent the day fortifying his position, not with weapons but with knowledge. He sat inside the chapel, the steel box open beside him, and methodically went through its contents. He read the journals, the elegant script detailing the life of a community, the births and deaths, the harvests and the hardships. He examined the deeds, the tangible proof of ownership that Sterling had dismissed as folklore. And he listened to the tapes. One by one, he threaded the spools into the player and turned the crank, listening to the voices of Havenwood. Men and women, young and old, each adding their testimony to the chorus of defiance. They spoke of Sterling's father or grandfather, of his false promises and veiled threats, of the slow, creeping dread as their neighbors left until they were the last ones standing. With each voice, Elias felt his own resolve harden. This was not an abstract historical injustice. It was a collection of personal stories, of lives and legacies purposefully erased. The weight of the box was no longer just physical, it was moral. He was the custodian of a promise made across 60 years of silence. He had made one call on his satellite phone, a short, terse conversation with Margaret, the county clerk. He told her what he had found, who he had met. He gave her the name Sterling. He heard her sharp intake of breath. "The Watershed Authority is a private corporation with a state charter," she had said, her voice tight with anger. "They operate with almost no oversight."
"Be careful, Elias." He had simply told her where he was and asked her to have the county sheriff and someone from the State Historical Society meet him here, at dawn. If he wasn't there, they should look in the cellar. It was the only contingency he could plan for. As the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the slate roof, he heard them coming. Not a single man this time, but the sound of several people moving through the woods, accompanied by the clank of metal and the low thrum of a generator. Ghost was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias moved to the doorway, the small chapel at his back like a fortress. Sterling emerged from the trees, the rain plastering his expensive hair to his forehead. He was no longer smiling. Behind him were 3 other men, dressed in heavy work gear. They carried shovels, pry bars, and a portable cement mixer.
One of them, a younger man with the weary eyes and squared shoulders of a former soldier, met Elias's gaze for a second before looking away. This was Ben, the conflicted insider, though Elias did not yet know his name. "Vance!" Sterling shouted over the rising wind. "This is your last chance. Give me the box. We are sealing this structure. It's a public safety measure, fully authorized." He held up a piece of paper, already limp from the rain. It was a meaningless work order, a prop for his charade of legitimacy. "You're not sealing anything," Elias called back, his voice steady. "Don't be a fool," Sterling yelled, his voice thin against the wind. "You can't win this." He gestured to his men. "Let's get this done." The men moved forward, their expressions grim. They were just doing a job. Elias stood his ground, Ghost, a fixed point of menace at his side. The confrontation felt inevitable, a physical clash he had no interest in but would not back down from. But the mountain had its own plan. At that moment, a tremendous gust of wind tore through the grove, howling like a grieving animal. An ancient, half-dead oak on the slope above the chapel, weakened by years of rot and now assaulted by the storm, gave way. There was a sickening crack, a sound like a giant bone snapping, and the massive tree began to fall, its branches clawing at the sky as it crashed down directly toward the chapel. Elias reacted on pure instinct, shoving himself back from the doorway. Sterling and his men scrambled away. The tree hit the ground with an earth-shaking impact, a huge, heavy branch smashing into the side of the chapel, sending a shower of stone and mortar flying. Another thick limb, the size of a telephone pole, slammed down right where Elias had been standing moments before. He was knocked off his feet by the concussion, his head hitting the stone floor. The world swam for a second. He pushed himself up, his ears ringing. He was alive. Then he heard a sound that cut through the roar of the storm and the ringing in his ears. A sharp, high-pitched cry of pain. Ghost. He scrambled to the doorway. The massive branch that had nearly crushed him had pinned his dog. Ghost was trapped, his hind leg caught under the immense weight of the limb. He was struggling, whining, his eyes wide with pain and fear, looking right at Elias. Sterling saw it all. He stood a safe distance away, the rain streaming down his face,
a look of grim triumph in his eyes. He saw the fallen tree, the blocked entrance, the injured dog, the dazed man. He saw his opportunity. "Leave the dog, Vance," Sterling shouted, his voice cutting through the gale. "You can't save both. It's just an animal. The box. Get the box and get out, if you can." Leave him. It's the only call. The mission is paramount. The words, screamed by Sterling in the storm, were a perfect, horrifying echo of the words on the radio that day in the desert.
The command from his past. The choice that had broken him. Leave the wounded man. Save the mission. He had followed that order. He had turned his back on his teammate and gotten on the helicopter, the man's voice swallowed by the whir of the rotors. He had lived with the ghost of that choice ever since. For a heart-stopping second he froze. His gaze flickered from Ghost, struggling and crying out for him, to the steel box sitting in the center of the chapel. The Ark. The promise. The mission. His past and his present collided in that single, terrible moment. He could try to save the box, to fulfill his duty to the dead. Or he could save the living, breathing partner who had never left his side. There was no choice. Not this time. He turned his back on the box. He turned his back on Sterling. He ignored the mission. He moved toward his friend. "I'm coming, boy," he said,
his voice a low, steady promise against the storm. "I'm coming." He grabbed the rusted iron bar he had used to open the cellar and jammed it under the massive tree limb. He put all his weight, all his strength, all his focus into that one single point of leverage. The wood was slick with rain. The bar slipped. He repositioned it, his knuckles scraping raw against the bark. He grunted, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest. The limb didn't move. It was too heavy. He could hear Sterling laughing, a faint, cruel sound carried on the wind. He saw the other men starting to move again, their path to the chapel now clear. He ignored them. He set his feet, took a deep breath, and tried again. "Come on," he grunted, to the log, to himself, to God. It was then that he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. It was the young worker, Ben. He was holding a long, heavy-duty pry bar from their equipment.
Their eyes met across the rain-swept clearing. In the young man's face, Elias saw the same conflict he had just vanquished in himself. The conflict between the job and what is right. Ben gave a barely perceptible nod. While Sterling was shouting instructions to the other men, Ben walked toward the fallen tree, his movements casual, almost clumsy. He tripped on a root, stumbling forward, and the heavy pry bar flew from his hands, landing in the mud just a few feet from Elias. "Sorry, boss," Ben called out, picking himself up. "Slippery out here." Sterling shot him an irritated glance but was too focused on the prize to pay it any more mind. It was the tool Elias needed. It was longer, stronger, with a better fulcrum point. He grabbed it. He wedged it deep under the limb, found a solid purchase on a rock below, and threw his entire being into the effort. The bar bit into the wood. The muscles in his arms and back bunched into knots. With a great, groaning creak, the massive limb lifted. Just an inch. Then 2. It was enough. "Go, Ghost! Go!" Elias yelled. The dog, whining in pain, scrambled backward, dragging his injured leg free. He was clear. Elias let the limb crash back down, his body trembling with exhaustion. He stumbled to Ghost's side, running a hand over the dog's back, checking the injury. The leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, broken, but the bleeding wasn't severe. He was alive,
Elias had done it. He had stayed. He had chosen loyalty. In the heart of the storm, he had faced the ghost of his past and made a different choice. A wave of something vast and quiet washed through him, a feeling so foreign he barely recognized it. It was peace. Just then, through the driving rain, he saw the flashing red and blue lights. A sheriff's vehicle and a state park's truck were bumping down the overgrown track toward the lake. Margaret had come through.
Ben's small act of defiance, his clumsy toss of the pry bar, had bought them the time they needed. Sterling saw the lights and froze. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. His plan, his authority, his entire world of polite threats and bureaucratic power was unraveling in the pouring rain. The tide had turned, not with a bang, but with a choice. The choice to save a friend. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The wind was gone, the rain had passed, and the sun cast a pale, watery light over a landscape that looked washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. At the edge of the lake, the scene was one of controlled, careful activity. A county sheriff's deputy stood by his vehicle, while two people from the State Historical Society, a man and a woman, were carefully examining the fallen tree and the damaged wall of the chapel. The steel box sat on a blanket on the ground, its contents being gently catalogued. The story of Havenwood was finally in safe hands. A short distance away, Sterling was talking to the sheriff. His expensive jacket was stained with mud, his hair was a mess, and the confident, commanding aura he had projected was completely gone. He looked smaller, diminished, a man stripped of his power, forced to answer questions he could no longer dismiss with a checkbook or a threat. Elias watched for a moment, feeling no triumph, only a quiet sense of rightness. He was sitting on a log, Ghost lying at his feet. A local veterinarian called out by Margaret had come and gone, setting and splinting the dog's broken leg. Ghost was sedated and sleeping, his breathing deep and even. Elias had his olive jacket draped over the dog to keep him warm. He gently stroked the dog's head, his touch a silent apology and a profound thank you. He heard a car door close and looked up. A woman was walking toward him from the direction of the access road. She was in her late 30s, with his same dark hair and a familiar, determined set to her jaw. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in almost 2 years, not since he had first begun his retreat from the world. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes taking in the scene, the chapel, the officials, his own weary state, the injured dog at his feet. Her expression was a complex mixture of concern, relief, and a hint of exasperation that was uniquely hers.
"Margaret called me," she said, her voice quiet. "She said you might need a ride. And a brother." Elias looked at her, at the sister who had never stopped trying to reach him, even when he had built walls of silence between them. He had been so lost in the echoes of his own past that he had forgotten the people who were his present. "You came," he said. The two words were heavy with everything he couldn't say. "I'm sorry. I missed you. I'm glad you're here." She understood. She always had.
She gave a small, sad smile and sat down on the log beside him, leaving a small, respectful space between them. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, simply watching the sun grow stronger on the water. The silence wasn't empty or avoidant. It was a bridge. It was the beginning of a repair. For the first time in years, Elias felt anchored not just by the dog at his feet, but by the family at his side. He was no longer adrift. Later that day, Margaret informed him of the outcome. The Watershed Authority, faced with the contents of the box and the potential for a public scandal, had immediately disavowed Sterling and his unsanctioned actions. The land on which the chapel stood, along with a significant buffer around it, was being ceded to the state park system to be preserved as a historical landmark. The chapel would be restored, and the journals and tapes would form the core of a permanent exhibit. The story of Havenwood would be told.
"The state needs a caretaker for the site," Margaret said, looking at him with her sharp, knowing eyes. "Someone who understands the land. Someone who respects the story. The job is yours if you want it." Elias looked from the stone chapel to the quiet lake, then down at Ghost, who was beginning to stir. He had come to this place seeking an escape, a place to disappear. But instead he had found a reason to stay. He had found a post to man, a watch to stand. "I'll take it," he said. Months passed. The seasons turned. The harsh white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring. The chapel on the north shore of Blackwood Lake was no longer a ruin. A team of restoration experts, using the old Abernathy journals as a guide, had repaired the roof, stabilized the walls, and replaced the glass in the windows. The small bell in the tower, polished and rehung, now caught the morning sun. It was not a museum piece. It felt alive, a quiet testament to endurance.
Elias stood on the shoreline, the cool morning air on his face. Beside him, Ghost stood patiently, his splint long gone. The dog walked with a slight, permanent limp, a physical reminder of the storm and the choice. He was a veteran with one more scar, one more story to carry. They stood together, two old soldiers in the quiet of a new day, watching the light move across the water. Elias no longer wore his exile like a shield. His posture was still disciplined, but the watchfulness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a sense of calm possession. This was his place now. His peace was not born of emptiness, but of purpose. He had not outrun his memory. He had made peace with it by refusing to create another. He had found redemption not in a grand battle, but in a small, quiet act of loyalty. The ghost in his heart was finally silent. Not because it was gone, but because he had learned to listen to the other voices, the ones that spoke of faith and stone and the enduring strength of a story that refused to be drowned. We end this story here, at the edge of a quiet lake, with a man and his dog standing watch over a promise that was kept. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles we fight are not in distant lands, but in the quiet, forgotten chapels of our own hearts. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, of a choice that haunts you, know this: God's grace is not always a lightning strike. More often, it is a quiet opportunity, a chance to make a different choice. It is the loyalty of a good dog, the unexpected help of a stranger, the strength to stay when everything in you wants to run. The world tells you to be strong, to be efficient, to put the mission first. But the quiet miracles happen when we choose loyalty, when we choose to tend to the wounded thing at our feet, whether it's an animal, a person, or our own soul. Elias thought he needed silence to heal, but what he really needed was a story to serve, a truth to protect. He found his second chance not by forgetting his past, but by honoring someone else's. May you find the strength to face your own storms. May you have the wisdom to recognize the small acts of defiance and grace that turn the tide. And may you learn, as Elias did, that true peace is found not in escaping our ghosts, but in giving them a place to rest. If this story found you today, share it with someone who is standing their own watch. Comment with a simple, "I will stay," as a promise to yourself and to the quiet truths you are called to protect. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of faith and the quiet work of God in our ordinary lives. May God bless you and keep you, and may you always, always choose to stay.